So that's an example of how profound the initial encounters could be. Um, the Inuit always avoided Europeans when they could. They had traded somewhat more openly with the Norse colonists that had planted those couple of small colonies on Greenland in the few hundred years prior. But the Western Europeans that showed up in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, the Inuits tried to avoid at all costs, and they were actually quite resourceful. The Inuit were the Umiaks that the video talked about. Those were these whaling vessels. Actually, they were like these big kayaks that hunting teams would go out onto to harvest whales now and then. They didn't hunt them to extinction or anything like that. They used the animals for their resources. So it also illustrates how negative the encounters could be. And you saw the Englishmen showed up, and the first thing they do was kidnap someone. And the purpose for kidnapping them was to prove that they had been somewhere. And so, again, I talked about how this was one of the worst times for this encounter to have possibly happened, because Western Europe, like England, they were engaged in this period of expansion and a period of considerable obsession about making money. And the kind of people like Frobisher were not diplomats, they were soldiers of fortune. They were essentially mercenaries out to make money, and as much money as they could. That's why sometimes these things would happen, that the encounters would be very negative. So moving on to the back to the Jamestown story. So Jamestown was the first English colony that persisted. We talked about the Roanoke ones, and those failed. But since the Roanoke expedition, Powhatan, who had been around for that, he took advantage of internal dissent and disease among people in his area to take advantage of internal disputes in the Confederacy to consolidate his power. So the English were forced to deal with him when they showed up in 1607, the expedition in which John Smith arrived. And somehow the English made the same mistakes as they did in the Roanoke expedition. They failed to plan for how to eat, and they suffered heavy losses in their first winter as a result. And relations got worse as the natives would refuse to just give the English all their food. So John Smith, possibly what had caused the whole ceremony in which he thought he might be executed, was possibly his attempts to persuade Powhatan to become a vassal, become a subordinate to the English king. This would have required Powhatan to accept a ceremonial crown and then kneel before the English people, which he refused to do. He eventually did take the crown and gave Smith kind of a headpiece in which he thought was an equal exchange, most likely. The English, though, they interpreted that as Powhatan subordinating himself to English authority. And so they came back the next winter and said, "You took our crown, you must now give us all your food." And he did not. And his hope was that the English would starve and leave, either leave or die. They almost did, but Jamestown was resupplied at the last minute and by English ships, and the English then attacked the Powhatans' nearby village in retaliation for their stinginess of the food imports. That's what started the war in 1610, which only ended when John Rolfe married Pocahontas. Rolfe was instrumental in bringing a strain of tobacco to Virginia, which grew well and the Europeans craved. The settlers became so obsessed with growing that because it was the thing they were looking for. They were looking for a way to make money, and they had all kinds of plans of how to make money. And they found it when they discovered this tobacco strain both grew well in Virginia and sold well back in Europe. And so they produced so much of it that they didn't leave enough room in their farmland for crops to eat, and they also polluted their water supply. So then they went back to the Powhatans demanding more food, which they would sometimes trade for and sometimes try to intimidate them for. Generally, they would trade weapons for food, weapons and metal goods. But they did avoid another war. By 1619, though, Powhatan died, and the person who took over as the Werowance, or kind of the nominal leader of the Confederacy, you can see here, this image on the left is the collection of villages that made up the Powhatan Confederacy. These images here also illustrate it, and illustrate where a few of the English settlements were. And this illustrates John Smith's exploration routes. So by 1619, Powhatan died, and his younger brother, Opechancanough, he took over as Werowance, and he was very worried about the decline in his population due to disease, and very worried about the Virginians creating new settlements as well as expanding into Powhatan land. So that caused some of them want to expel the colonists, and resentment got worse when one of the leaders of the expulsion movement, I guess the anti-English contingent in the Powhatan Confederacy, was led by a medicine man named Namadanu. He was shot by an English settler, and that caused some of the Powhatan Confederacy to want to go to war, but they bided their time. What Opechancanough thought his time was 1622. And they planned an attack to occur on Good Friday, knowing that was a religious holiday. And in March of 1622, hundreds of Powhatan warriors entered into the English villages unarmed, which the English were used to seeing them do because trade activities would commence. But then what they did was grab whatever weapons were available and started killing the settlers indiscriminately. That all was highly coordinated to take place across the various English outposts, and the result was disastrous. It was kind of a sneak attack and a surprise attack, and it killed 350 settlers, but 350 to 400. That was a lot of people. The total population of English colonists in Virginia in this whole area in 1622 was around 1,200. Now, more had passed through in between those times, but a lot of people died, or they didn't stay very long. So that was about 1/4 of the English population. And the English retaliated for that. The retaliation was severe. The attacks against the Powhatan Confederacy, the various tribes, would be indiscriminate. They would attack civilians, they would attack food supplies, and especially the cornfields that the various peoples had, or the various natives grew. So those attacks took their toll. The Powhatan Confederacy, Opechancanough, eventually sued for peace, and the English population started to grow more aggressively, and the native population started to stagnate. Over the next 10 years, the English population grew to over 5,000. mainly because of immigration, not so much because of natural increase, but because they were sending more settlers. And by the 1640s, the English population in the Chesapeake region was over 8,000. And they began to seize lands that had belonged to the Powhatan Confederacy, arguing that they were quote unquote empty. What had happened was the population had declined, and the English just said, well, this is our land now. Opechancanough understood what was going on. By 1644, he was a 90-year-old man, but he still had respect, and so he led a last-ditch effort to try to drive the English out again. This effort killed about 400 settlers this time. Again, it was a coordinated surprise attack. It was highly successful, but the counterattack was much more successful this time. At the end of the 1644 uprising, Opechancanough himself was captured. As a result, he was executed. And that was the kind of end of immediate resistance right on the Chesapeake Bay area. There were 6 major native communities that made up the Powhatan Confederacy. The Powhatan grouping themselves, another group called the Wyandot, the Nansemond, the Pamunkey, the Appomattox, and Chickahominy. You can see some of these groupings here on this map. Appomattox there, Powhatan there. Let's see here, Nansemond down here, and various others. So after the 1644 uprising, the representatives of the remaining communities that still had some population, they signed a peace treaty, and they recognized a single leader of the various villages that remained. And this man was named Nakotawants, and he accepted a title from the English that established him as a vassal of the King of England, which is what they had wanted Powhatan to do when the English first showed up. Thereafter, the Indians in the area paid a tribute of beaver skins every year to the colonial government of Virginia, and they could only sell land with the colony's permission, and they could not enter any territory deemed English land. And who would decide what was English land and what wasn't was decided by the English. They didn't completely disappear, although they were severely constrained after that and suffered further encroachment and expansion into their territory due to the tobacco economy. Some of the communities still exist. For example, the Pamunkey Indian tribe, which was one of the first to ever meet any English people in this area. They were only federally recognized by the Bureau of Indian Affairs as an independent tribe in 2015, and they still consider the 1646 treaty to be in effect. And they have a reservation near what's today King William, Virginia, and they actually still go through the annual ritual of showing up with deer skins to give to the Virginia government. And it's just a ceremony that they do now. But what's important about that kind of thing, you see a lot of tribes will do that kind of ceremony, is because the treaty recognized them as an independent government. And so some tribes will still engage in those treaty obligations because it legally recognizes them as an independent community of people that govern themselves, not that's distinct from the United States. And those treaties actually date back to well before the time when the United States was a country.